Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for April 25th, 2023. Today we're going to take a look at more provocative bullying coming from the transatlantic empire. In this case, we're seeing a growing desperation that the Ukraine war is not succeeding in destroying Russia, that there's a growing move toward breaking with the unipolar order, toward multilateralism, that there's a move to de-dollarize the world economy. And so we're seeing in their desperation both an escalation, but also an absolute infantile mentality, as though they can play the usual tricks and games and force people to tremble in their presence. But at this point, the fear of the Anglo-American empire, while it should be sustained, it's real. These are dangerous lunatics. But you have to stand up. And many countries around the world, many leaders around the world, and many people around the world are finding the courage to stand up and say, we're not going to go along with this. So let's take a look at some of the most recent efforts designed to undermine the historic reversal of the unipolar order, which is underway. Let's start with what, to me, is the most infantile of all provocations. The U.S. State Department refusing to grant visas to Russian reporters who were coming to the United States to cover the UN Security Council session, which is chaired this time by Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, as Russia is now the temporary chairman of the UN Security Council. Why would they stop Russian reporters from coming in to see this? We know that they're not going to cover it in the U.S. media, what's being presented, because what's the topic? The topic is multilateralism, ending sanctions. The U.S. media is not going to cover that, honestly, neither will the European media. But why stop the Russian media from covering it? Well, their attempt is to make sure that nobody knows about the moves away from the unipolar order, as though that ignorance will somehow protect their dominance and hegemony. Now then we have an article in the Washington Post, which is an article that reflects discussion going on in Europe about how the growing peace movement, which is building in Germany, that is the call for an end to the war in Ukraine, an end to the arms shipments and move to negotiations, that this is really just a Russian operation, that you have the February 25th demonstration of 50,000 people in Berlin. This is just Russian manipulation of ignorant Germans. Now, do you really need to have Moscow telling you that a war in Europe is bad? And the fact that you have now the so-called left and the so-called right, that is Wagenknecht, the AfD in Germany, military people and others coming out into the streets in protest. The idea that this is run by Moscow is absurd, just as the story of Russiagate in the U.S. in the 2016 election is absurd. But this is how desperate people try to use lies and censorship to control the narrative. Then you have Annalena Baerbock, who probably would be better off going back to trampolining, ordering the expulsion of 20 Russian diplomats from Germany, as though these 20 Russian diplomats were probably the ones orchestrating the peace movement in Germany. And of course, the Russians then expelled German diplomats from Moscow. Then you have probably one of the more interesting ones, Fox News firing Tucker Carlson. And while some said this came as a shock, anyone who's been watching Fox has noticed that Fox is not really an opposition media anymore. But what's the story here? Well, when it comes to Tucker Carlson, my view of him is probably close to Ronald Reagan's expressed view of Lyndon LaRouche. I may not agree with everything he says, but I agree with a lot of what he says. He's got the largest viewership of any news program in the United States. And he's been highly critical of the neocon war drive and the war propaganda. He's bringing in spokesmen from different viewpoints, from Glenn Greenwald and Jimmy Dore to Rand Paul. And he's allowing different voices to be heard as to why the policy of the United States of constant war, of regime change, is not in the interests of America. Now, not coincidentally, Tucker Carlson is on the same hit list of the Ukraine Defense and Security Offices that have put Helga Zepp LaRouche and me on a hit list, as well as people like Glenn Greenwald. So the firing of Tucker Carlson, we'll see what comes of this, but it's obviously an attempt to silence a voice of opposition to this permanent warfare. Now then you have European foreign ministers meeting in Luxembourg to discuss more arms for Ukraine, which probably means more arms into the black market would show up in the hands of terrorists around the world, and more money in the pockets of the Zelensky government and his supporters. Then we have an interesting development of Brazilian President Lula on a trip to Portugal and Spain, but before he could address the parliament, pro-war protesters interrupted him, and Lula decided to cancel his presentation. Now, meanwhile, the European Union foreign ministers had a document leaked in which they identified Lula as a pro-Russian threat to Europe, warning that his seeking peace negotiations is really functioning as a pro-Russian operative. The same line, the same nonsense, which assumes that people are so stupid that they would buy into this idea that President Putin must be the most powerful person in the world because he can turn around elections in the United States and Europe. Now, finally, you have, I mentioned this yesterday, forums taking place in the United States this week of something called the Free Nations of Post-Russia Forum. This is a group calling for the breakup of Russia. A regime change in Russia so the raw material resources can be grabbed by Western cartels. Now, some people have expressed opposition to the idea that there's anything being deployed against Russia, that this is just Russian paranoia. Well, here you have it. This is a group which is involved in anti-Russian terrorism, anti-Russian propaganda, and they're having forums in Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and New York City this week to promote the idea of breaking up Russia. Now, imagine if you had in Russia sponsorship of Americans calling for the breakup of the United States, the succession of states from the Union. Well, in fact, that was tried once. It was tried during the U.S. Civil War by the British government of Lord Palmerston, which was involved in supporting the Southern succession to try to move the South and to break up the Union. And who came to the defense of the Union? Tsar Alexander II of Russia, who sent the Russian fleet to New York and San Francisco, if necessary, to help break up a British blockade. So again, if you look at history, you'll see that the real enemy of the United States has never been Russia, but is the British Empire. Now, let me note also that on May 4th and 5th, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization will be meeting in Goa, India, under Indian direction. And for the first time, the Pakistani foreign minister will be attending. Now, I've linked at the bottom of the description page today 2 events from the last 2 weekends, which had many speakers engaging in in-depth, profound discussion of the issues confronting the human race today, of war, of peace, of economic development, of the cultural war against the populations that's being waged by this same empire of lies. And what you'll see is necessary debate, dialogue, including especially a discussion of the danger of nuclear war. And 3 speakers in particular addressed this in the Diane Sara for Senate event, namely Helga Zepp LaRouche, Stephen Starr, and Scott Ritter. Take some time to watch these presentations. Think about what's being said, not just as a citizen of your country, but think about your responsibility to the children, the youngest children on the planet right now, who deserve to grow up in a world free from war, free from sanctions, free from poverty. who deserve to live in nations that are sovereign and that can act to address the needs for access to healthcare and education, decent jobs. This is the world that has to be created by breaking from the unipolar order, which is a world that's emphasizing the importance of protecting the privilege of the elite at the expense of the vast majority of the world's population. To create that world of unlimited opportunity where children can develop their full potential depends on what you do and what you choose to do. And you should join us so that we can give children the right to a chance for a better future. So look at these two conferences. They're lengthy. Pick out the speeches that you think are the most compelling and send them to your friends, to the people you're arguing with, that you're talking to. Let's have a real dialogue in the West, not one that's controlled by media censorship and the corporate cartels. Thanks for joining me. See you again tomorrow. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.